Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Modern Psychoanalytic Studies annual conference, Dreaming the Sessions. I'd like to welcome in particular our presenters today, Giuseppe Civatarese, Lawrence Brown, and Barbara D'Amato. I'd also like to welcome all of our participants from around the country. We have people this morning joining us from California, Washington State, New Mexico. We have people coming to us from Florida and many different places. Let me please remind everybody if they could please mute themselves. I want to give a special thank you and a welcome to my friends from Southern California. Good morning to you. From Colorado and from Louisville, Kentucky. I'm glad you're able to join us. I want to thank the Lynn Laub Fund for their generous support of today's conference. And before we start today's conference, I'd like to take care of a few administrative announcements. I should introduce myself to begin with. I'm Richard Sachs. I am the chairperson for today's conference. I know many people are interested in knowing about how to get their CE credits. So let me give you some simple instructions. At the end of the conference, an evaluation form will be emailed to all attendees. The form provides feedback for CMPS in our conference planning. It also includes a space to fill in your license information. Your CE credit letters will be sent to you within 2 weeks of the conference. I will repeat at the end of today's conference how to go about getting your CE credits for those people who will be joining us later in the day. I wanted to review the morning schedule so everyone knows what we will be listening to this morning. After my welcoming comments, we will have our keynote speaker, Giuseppe Civatarese, will be presenting his paper, Are Dreams Still Central to Psychoanalysis? Following Giuseppe's paper, we will have a 15-minute break. After that break, we will come back for our next two presenters, Lawrence Brown. He will be presenting a paper called 3 Unconscious Pathways to Representing the Analyst's Experience: Reverie, Countertransference Dreams, and Joke Work. And following Lawrence Brown's presentation, we will have our third presenter of the morning, Barbara D'Amato. She will present a paper entitled Don't wake me up. At the end of Dr. D'Amato's paper, we will have our lunch break for 45 minutes, and then we will resume at 1:30. On to the conference for today. Dreaming the session. Field theory perspectives on hallucinosis, dreaming, and reverie in daily clinical work. The theory of dreams has changed fundamentally since Freud's time, when their primary function was seen as protecting sleep by distorting and hiding repressed materials from consciousness. Many contemporary psychoanalysts emphasize the transformative functions of dreams to create sense and meaning for lived experience. Consequently, the way we use dreams in our daily clinical work has changed radically. The dream is no longer viewed as belonging exclusively to the analysand. We listen to virtually any verbal and nonverbal communication as a joint dream of the analytic couple, dreamed in the here and now. Our first presenter will be our keynote speaker, Giuseppe Civaterese. He is a training and supervising analyst in the Italian Psychoanalytic Society and a member of the American Psychoanalytic Association and the International Psychoanalytic Association. He's in private practice in Pavia, Italy. He lectures internationally and publishes widely on various subjects, including the theory of the analytic field, beyond and post-beyond psychoanalysis. He's written many books. I will name just a few. The Violence of Emotions and the Analytic Field and its Transformations, Truth and the Unconscious. He is the past editor-in-chief of the Rivista di Psicoanalisi, the Journal of the Italian Psychoanalytic Society. Benvenuto, Giuseppe, welcome.
Thank you very much, Richard. It's a pleasure. Do you want that I start or?
Yes, you're ready. You can start right now.
Okay, fine, good. Well, first of all, I want to thank you, you and the Center for Modern Psychoanalytic Studies for the kind invitation. Of course, I would have much more preferred to stay there with you in New York, which is a place I love, but it's okay. We have to do this through Zoom. So the title of my paper is Getting the Picture. Are dreams still central to psychoanalysis? The history of psychoanalysis is the history, as we know, of the discovery and invention of the unconscious. Each new model gives a different version of it because it introduces new concepts that change the whole theory. However, it is possible to point to a trend line or red thread that ties them all together. just to get some idea of continuity. Every time a new important concept is introduced, the field of observation widens and includes a little more of the analyst's subjectivity, which is a way of expanding our understanding of unconscious processes of mind. With transference, for example, the analyst participate as a blank screen. Of course, I need to simplify here. With countertransference as a person, with projective identification, she's more deeply involved. With enactment, as if there were a sort of time machine, she finds herself unconsciously acting out scripts written by the patient in his past, from which, however, she's able to return to the present, bringing with her this knowledge experienced in the first person. With the field, she always writes new scripts together with the patient, in which they try to give sense and meaning to the shared emotional experience, which is therefore in front of everyone's eyes. In the meantime, we have moved from a vision of the unconscious as a Dantesque hell to a vision of the unconscious as a function of the personality that creates maps to orient yourself in the world. As a result, also the theory of dreaming changes. Dreaming does not distort the truth, but transforms raw sensoriality, protosensoriality into meaningful images and creates the only truth that seems possible to us, that is, at its 0 degree, emotional and intersubjective. Moreover, dreaming is no longer only an activity that occurs when we are asleep, but it's a continuous process that takes place also in waking life. Finally, in my opinion, the third highly original aspect of Bion theory is in the way which, for example, by theorizing the concept of the O of the session, he transfuses into individual psychoanalysis his theory of groups, maybe the most original and important legacy in the end we have from him. So the main therapeutic factor is no longer the explication offered to the patient of how his unconscious works, even if based on the experience of transference neurosis, but intersubjective recognition. Not so much the search for contents as foreign bodies of the mind to be removed, but the development of functions that are inherently social. Interpretation is no longer so much the golden instrument that magically, so to say, promotes therapeutic change, but it demotes itself to a mode of listening. It's no longer so much about what the analyst says, but how she or he listens. Interpretation no longer has value in itself, but mostly kept in the analyst's mind, works as a guide for recognition, in Bion's terms, atonement. We understand that by now the analyst is working with a new theory of the mind. This theory is inspired by the model of the mother-child, or better, mother-infant relationship. The infant, as says the Latin word from which it derives, does not speak yet. Therefore, we must have a theory that is able to explain how the mind is first formed, even though, so to speak, it has no access to verbal information and instructions. The centrality of representation in Freud, which is a concept made for Ricoeur, leaves ground to the centrality that in Bion has instead emotion. Emotion is in itself a point of view on the world, like a traffic light that continuously informs the subject. This is green, love, this is red, hate, this is yellow, knowledge. For Bion, the goal to be pursued by the analyst is to develop the patient's mind. This is achieved by increasing the common capacity of the field or system or group of two formed by analyst and analysand to give meaning to the shared emotional experience. This is why he says that the most important thing is to intuit what is the O of the session. By the O of the session, we can mean the unconscious and shared emotion, or the basic assumption of this small group, or metaphorically, the color of the traffic light. If it is red, it means that if we don't stop and think, but go on, unpleasant accidents can occur. I infer from this that there might be a deficiency of attunement in a given moment, which we can think of as the device that every time allows us to revert from red to green. How do we know what color the traffic light is? Directly, we cannot know, because it is an emergent property of the unconscious field that is automatically generated when two people meet. Valences, as Bion calls them, are activated, a contagion, Freud, or even an infection, Hegel, occurs. At our disposal, we have mainly words, tales, stories. Our task is to be as receptive as possible to the discourse of the unconscious. When talking about concrete and real things, we listen and store, of course, this information. However, we will not be analysts if we did not ask also ourselves, yes, but why this? Why now? What can it mean from the unconscious point of view? Not only that, whether it is the analyst or the patient who is speaking, from the point of view of the unconscious plane of communication, since I cannot know what is only his and what is only mine, exclusively at this unconscious level, I have to listen, or at least I listen from this, within this model, as if it were always the we speaking. Otherwise, we would not need to use the metaphor of fear. I have recalled these principles in a very summary way and with inevitable simplifications in order to try to explain the well-known concept of the analytic field theory of transformation into dreaming. Or maybe also it can be said into play. The analyst listens to the patient's or his own account of the dream of the night as if it were the account of the dream they are dreaming together here and now. But in the same way, she also listened to the dream, so to say, of concrete reality. In fact, in analysis, there is no discourse, ideally, no matter how pertinent to concrete reality, on whose value of unconscious communication you cannot, and indeed you should, question yourself. It's clear that for Bion, dreaming becomes equivalent to thinking or to digest emotional experience. There is no other way for a human being to make sense of reality than by listening to the conversation in which the members of her inner group are constantly engaged. However, when an individual suffers psychically, the inner group is no longer enough. Then he needs to engage in a larger conversation with other people, with their inner groups. This is what always happens in everyday life. The analyst is someone who offers herself professionally to create, together with the patient, a more effective psychic space to contain his anxieties. She presents herself as someone who, under certain conditions, is able to look at the, so to say, traffic light and know what color it is. Therefore, when we say transformation into a dream, all we mean is that we must always remember to look at the traffic light, the unconscious shared emotion, or we can also say the emotional function that links in a given moment patient and analyst. And that there are always signals in the field that must be taken responsibility for. It does not mean, I want to stress this point, it does not mean in the least to neglect reality, which might well be known and remembered as such, but which gives me information, if anything, about the unconscious of the other and not about the O of the session, as we defined it before. That is about how we are functioning now as a system, field, dynamic, gestalt. It does not mean minimizing the burden of trauma, of course. It does not mean indoctrinating the patient, nor does it mean making explicit the vision informed by psychoanalytic theory that the analyst is using. It means to try to have a happy conversation that is a dialogic exchange, obviously made also of non-verbal communication, that serves to transform non-tolerable emotions into tolerable ones, and so to say, to pass the method to do this transformation. Ultimately, the concept of transformation into dreaming is just a trick to force us not to collapse continuously on reality, neither on concrete reality nor psychic reality of just the patient, if this means not to consider the analyst's deep participation in the analytic process. More precisely, I should say that it is inevitable to continuously collapse on reality. This is how we think, this is how we function also in a session, but that ideally, sooner or later, we should let ourselves be surprised by something that imposes itself and questions us about its possible meaning seen from the unconscious and common point of view. And this could be, we can remember the oscillation, negative capability, fate, and selected fact for those who are already acquainted with Bion's jargon. The second step, going beyond the IU split and thus avoid falling into the relational trap of doer and done, is just essential to my eyes. Why? Because only if I listen to the analytic field can I really suspend my suspicious attitude towards the patient. And again, we have to name here Paul Ricoeur, who was the one to say that psychoanalysis belongs to the school of suspicion, together with Marx and Nietzsche. This attitude characterizes particularly classical psychoanalysis, but it is found in any model with a strong relational imprint also, that is, which focuses on the conscious and unconscious interaction between two separate subjects. I stop aligning myself with the patient's healthy part against the infernal part. I stop thinking of the patient as someone who has something infernal inside. I mean, I stop if I try to go beyond the you and I, so to say, split, and to get back to the we. Hell, if anything, as Sartre would say, is the other, the lack of recognition. Indeed, lack of recognition establishes in the personality a cruel internal critical agency, and therefore, by subjection to this agency, an essential split between spiritual or affective needs and material needs. I hope it is clear that when I consider the unconscious intersubjective plane, but be aware, for me, intersubjective means common, indistinct, third, and not trivially just interaction between two separate subjects. There will be a paper on this in one of the next issues of the JAPA for the ones of you who want to go deeper on this subject. So when I do this, I see a reverie or an action or a bodily sensation as belonging to the analytic field, never just my own or the patient. So this stems from the basic postulate from which this model comes. The problem of, for example, which is a common question, a common criticism that is made. No? For example, the problem of asking whether a reverie, for example, is not a countertransference phenomenon does not even arise. In fact, the basic postulate from which everything follows is that anything at the unconscious level has its roots in the field. Anything is seen as co-created, as jointly created. So it doesn't have any meaning then to ask yourself if it is if your reverie is something that is only about yourself or on the field. We have to respect our basic postulate. This kind of question, of course, would have meaning within another conceptual frame. So now let us to illustrate this point with some brief clinical vignette. I'll skip the first one. The second I sent, it's called the snail tiger. An analyst tells me that at the beginning of the analysis, she was afraid of her patient. In order to make me understand this, she tells me that she experienced her like a snail. In the meantime, while saying this, she mimes the gesture with her two hands as if she wanted to give me the idea of a ferocious animal that is about to grab you and tear you apart. This was through Zoom, and she made this gesture like this. And I was a bit surprised. No, when I was a kid, a playmate and I used to organize snail races in the long winters. And I never realized that they were such dangerous animals. So I suggested, I say, maybe more of a tiger than a snail. I replied jokingly to my colleague. We might think that such an aggressive snail, but by the way, I went back to the dictionary that says that it's a mollusk, to be precise, from the family of the pulmonate gastropods, might have represented a threat to the narcissism of the analyst, who would have wanted more positive feedback to the efforts made in therapy and faster. So snail is not so fast, but faster progress. It is significant, however, that mollusk is said in a derogatory tone of a person who is cowardly, inert, lacking in willpower and character. The fact remains that this snail tiger is an absolutely memorable character if we see it as a dreamlike seal of analysis. But also in the supervision, it's the same. Perhaps it could represent the fear of exposing oneself to new ideas, of not being able to make them one's own, and thus seeming slow, not clever, etc. In short, new ideas experienced as tigers disguised as snails. In summary, it would be legitimate to give the analyst's gesture, dramatization, action, an event in the supervision session, but to my eyes, it's the same logic that applies to session. We could see in this gesture the meaning of an action reverie, or we could say reverie in action, but lately I call it action reverie, honoring, remembering what they mean by action painting in arts and stuff. So a kind of action reverie that conveys an unconscious emotion that concerns both the patient. So both of them, not just the one or the other. No matter if it was in this case the supervisee to make this gesture, because how can we say unconsciously how I myself might have induced somehow, and vice versa. So when she's with the analyst and vice versa, but also when she's with me in supervision, my attitude then should be, having interpreted this event that was unconsciously, jointly constituted, for example, my attitude could be of scaling down the vision from above, super, to a degree that might be tolerated. Essentially, it is a sense of threat and therefore fear. Let's remember our red light metaphor of the other's judgment. This is why the snail's two harmless eye tentacles had turned into claws. So again, just to summarize, this little event, this action, can be seen as a piece of theater that was jointly created, that in a given moment it gives the possibility to us to deduce what the prevalent emotional function that is linking both of them is active in a given moment. And of course, if the air is intoxicated, it is not favorable to the construction of leaning, then asymmetrically after we need to do something. Next vignette, 24/7. S asks to reduce her session from 3 to 1, so 1 hour less. She often talks about a co-worker who is several years older than her and on whom she depends. She likes to work with her, but can take her only small doses, not 24/7. She gets under your skin. She has no respect for boundaries. I'm going to try to get some space, she says. For her part, even the analyst, despite a strong investment in S, feels tense, struggling to sustain the moment of silence. The emotional atmosphere of the session seems to be impregnated with mutual expectations that are somehow too pressing. It occurs to me that instead of the urge to understand, it would help them to imagine, for example, that they are at a bar with a friend talking about this and that, and they have all the time in the world to waste. Let us now to try to listen as analysts. The question would be, what is the possible unconscious meaning of what S is telling me about her colleague? Interpreting from a field frame, we could transform as a sentence into a dream. We have dreamt of a rather heavy colleague with respect to whom we need to find a little more space. We would no longer limit ourselves to seeing the colleague only as a real figure in the patient's external world, nor as a possible vehicle for transference projection. Instead, we would also see her as the allegory of an absolutely reciprocal emotional function that is active in the field in the here and now. Once the discourse, which apparently only deals with reality, has been listened to as a possible unconscious communication that the couple sends to itself, this does not mean that we then automatically know what the prevailing emotion is, the O of the session, but we have a point from to start from. For example, the 24/7 character might suggest that it is as if they never separate and that this is tiring. If I had to say, this seems the most likely hypothesis. They are telling each other that they are too much in each other's skin. As a consequence, the analyst will realize that A, it's not the patient who unilaterally attacks the analysis by asking for a reduction of the session, but the reduction seems to be a request that arises from a common need. So you see how dramatically the perspective can change if we allow ourselves to look at things from the we perspective. B, that there really seems to be a too much that suffocates the analysis and that is waiting to be reduced, less doses. C, that the pressure has not been reduced by a third, as the passage from 3 to 2 sessions would lead one to believe, but only by a 24th, since it's from 24/7 that it has become 23/7, just to play a bit with these details. Paradoxically, the 24/7 character might also suggest that if they found the right fit, they would very much want to be in touch, expressed hyperbolically forever. Next vignette, objection. The patient continually devalues the analyst, provokes her, in fact, describes her as an abject human being. In doing so, at the same time, he makes himself obnoxious and almost physically disgusting. He distracts himself, he does not listen. It happens that he's openly offensive, and so on. The analyst does not always manage to avoid responding to the provocation, and they often end up having something that looks a lot like bickering. The analyst then tends to give explanations and to engage on a fairly intellectual level. This situation lasts for very long periods of time. Gradually, in search of existence, I'd say, and survival, the analyst manages to avoid confrontations. She learns to tolerate silence better. She tries not to listen in terms of I and you, but of us. She comes to understand disgust no longer as hers towards the patient or the patient's towards her, but as a quality of the analytic field. No, remember our short sentence. We dreamt that we kept finding each other repugnant. In this way, it becomes possible for her to think of disgust as abjection, for example. That is, as accordingly to Julia Kristeva, as for the child, the need to separate from the mother's body. She's reminded of all the time when, seemingly inexplicably, the patient had told her that with her, he felt as if he was being suffocated or swallowed. She also intuits that this is the level, emotional, not verbal, at which the most important game of analysis is played. She has to allow this game of mutually making the other abject to fulfill its function of establishing a more livable distance. So you see, it changes absolutely completely. Disgust becomes like abjection, a character in the field that tells something important that unconsciously is going on. It is somehow jointly co-created. In the end, the way they are using to give meaning to their emotional experience. The next vignette is called lockdown or look down. A patient says, when you don't see me between sessions, you get angry. No, excuse me, this was an hallucinosis of an hallucinosis. This was the analyst saying that. But I will skip now. I will not try to interpret this because it's already quite complicated. So again, the analyst says, when you don't see me between sessions, you get angry. This is very common observation. The patient says, it's going to be the longest days. What if there is a lockdown? But in the text drafted by the colleague for supervision, there is a slip of the pen. The analyst, and this is an example of what I call transformation into hallucinosis. The analyst wrote not lockdown, unfortunately we are so used to this word nowadays, but look down. From our point of view, we could interpret the error as a hallucinosis, that is a dream from which one wakes up, an event that actually makes a dream a real dream. We never think that a dream is not just dreaming during the night. A dream becomes really a dream, a complete dream, only after we wake up from a dream. So if we see this error in this way, the error as dreaming during the night, and then when we realize that there was the error, the mistake, awakening from the dream, then it becomes a true dream, so to say, which therefore lends itself to be interpreted according to the concept or tool of transformation into hallucinosis. And it would be, for example, the fear we have is not so much separation for weekends, for vacation, for whatever, when it will be there, which is inevitable, but the fact that now in the session, I just felt separated from you because receiving such a brilliant interpretation from you, for example, I felt treated with contempt and arrogance, as if looked down upon. By the way, you will find a comment on this point of what does it mean for the patient, the feeling of being looked down upon in Secondary Thoughts by Bion, and in a commentary I wrote on his brief essay, which is called On Arrogance, and that is already available on the IJP website. Bion says, somehow arrived to understand that too many interpretations sound like looking down upon on the patient, or even sometimes on colleagues. This is a very interesting point. So it is obvious that the feeling would be entirely mutual. This is also important, because otherwise, again, we will not speak of the field. Why? Because, for example, if a patient feels reproached in such a way, looked down upon, of course, it would react aggressively. He would judge negatively the analyst, and the analyst in the end would end feeling the same sentiment. Okay. An analyst who felt so reproached would in turn feel looked down upon by the patient. This is my idea. The point then becomes to read the look down character as the indication of a field emotional function that needs to be changed. In fact, feelings of humiliation and shame can witness the failure of the process of mutual recognition. You know very well that our normal attitude, I mean normal classical, it is also in everyday culture, of reading a sleep, a parapraxis, is completely different. It's more kind of, I caught you, I got you. This is what escaped from your infernal unconscious hell, and now I see you through. Completely different, completely different. Another, I think we started earlier, so Richard, I think that we have even a bit more time of, so I can read all, thank you. I can read this also. I call this vignette the pleasure of the hour of analysis. A patient says, I'm in a building and I am hiding in a room. A woman opens the door and finds me. I have mixed feelings between the pleasure of being found and being discovered. This is another little, very little, tiny example of transformation in hallucinosis. Usually the example I give are very, very, very short. Otherwise, it would take too much time, they would be too complex, and we would always have the problem of confidentiality, but the method and the mechanism is absolutely the same. Now, let's go to the obvious reading would be between the pleasure of having been found and the fear of having been discovered. In fact, when the analyst reads the text, she adds the words that she had omitted to write for when she wrote the protocol for supervision. And in fact, the word that she adds and that was not written is fear. However, again, we could ask ourselves, what does it mean then that she had, or better, they had, unconsciously omitted it, thus letting us think the opposite, for example, that is, that it was pleasure in both cases. It would be mixed feelings between the pleasure of being found and the pleasure of being discovered. This would be a way to interpret this little mistake from an entirely different point of view. Could it be that under the apparent fear, in reality, so fear was close to consciousness because it was the word that the analyst added. But That's why we use transformation hallucinosis to possibly to know more. So could it be that under the apparent fear, in reality, the common experience is instead of pleasure, of feeling recognized for what she really is and what she is worth, and reciprocally? So this is another little example of how we can use these little fragments of narrative that reflect, in my view, the common, the third or the field or the two unconsciouses join together to form a system, something that is more of the starting elements, and together somehow trying to give meaning to emotional experience. A last example, Nutella in the diet. A patient says that at home, when she was a child, there was a diet that everyone had to follow, and it was very strict. There was little room for French fries, sausages, candies, Nutella, hamburgers, spaghetti with meat sauce, ice cream. I could have never accepted this, I tell you. You had to be ultra healthy, very, very healthy. So every calorie was counted. In her teenage years, she started to have problems with anorexia, and the problem was never completely found a solution. Obviously, from my point of view, is also, so you see, this is a recollection of memory. This is the past. This is concrete, something that really happened. The point is there a difference from what really happened and the narrative of what really happened today at 9:30 of the Tuesday-Monday session? In my opinion, yes, of course. And in the same way, there is a difference from the dream I had during the night and the telling of the dream in the here and now that requires a different understanding in the ongoing process of together creating meaning in the here and now. Of course, I'm not saying that this is the only perspective. This is this perspective. There are other perspectives. So this is what I mean when I say that we should not collapse on concrete reality on the past. Why? Because if we collapse on concrete reality, then of course we miss what possibly, hypothetically, we can get if we listen even to a recollection that regards the past and stuff as if it were a dream, which again is just a trick to tell yourself, please remember that we work with the compass of the unconscious. So ask yourself what the possible unconscious meaning of this is, which is not enough, because the second step is also, to me, important if you want to speak of field, that it's not you or me dreaming now, but it's us again, no matter who is the one that speaks for two. So obviously, A is also describing the dietary regime they have given themselves in analysis, all aimed at achieving high performance, very much under the control of a cruel superego, I'd say, which implies giving up the tastiest things. The analyst emphasizes the patient's self-hatred. So you see, this would be a common commentary, doing in this way in the past, or maybe even now, you show me that you are very severe with yourself and stuff. But did we ever ask ourselves, what do we get when we do this kind of observation? Isn't it that very easily, beyond many good things, also, in the end, we continue to tell the patient, you are crazy, you are crazy, you are crazy, because you treat yourself in such a way, you are bad stuff. Or isn't it that somehow with the very good intentions, we continue to tell the patient, I tell you, you don't change, you will suffer because in the end it's up to you. I think that this is what we get with many so-called transference interpretations. Huh? So, in fact, I was writing here, however, in doing so, she reminds her of her madness. She does not consider that the discourse on diets could be the truthful representation of what kind of truths as food for the mind, as Bion says, that is emotional tuning. They allow themselves to assume, in other words, both are suffering from a psychic diet that does not make enough room for pleasure and play, the tastiest things. So you see again how the panorama changes catastrophically, changes dramatically. One is centered on the patient, on the past, or even on her psychopathology. The other one says, okay, this is our dream. In our dream, we were following this cruel diet. Why? But if it is our dream, it's not just the patient. I am contributing to that. And by contract, I need to be capable of interpreting this, of trying to intuit what is going on at this unconscious level. And then I need to take responsibility for this and then to try to influence the emotional atmosphere in a way that this cruel way of working together can be changed in a favorable way. So to see, a very important point is that in this way, if I trust what together we unconsciously represent in our theater, somehow I stop telling the patient, you misunderstand, you are wrong. No, this is what our field unconsciouses together truly, they did the best they could to represent what is going on. So I trust myself, my unconscious, I trust your unconscious working with the mind. So in the end, I think that this is a way really to trust the patient, to try to give back the patient a safe place inside, which every patient, I think, in certain measure is lacking. So I hope I am able to, in a clear way, to try to convey how, in my opinion, listening in this way changes enormously. Huh? And by the way, if I listen in this way, do I forget, do I neglect knowing and reacting humanly to whatever I know about the patient past, all the information I have? Not at all, not at all. What do we talk about if not about the patient's life, the patient's past? By the way, all this understanding, in my opinion, should happen mainly in the analyst's mind. It's not about giving this explanation to the patient, making explicit our theory. Not at all. Not at all. With the patient, we need to stay mainly on the narrative that the patient proposes, not do any kind of magic change. Now, let's go back to theory. But then, what is the difference between transformation in hallucinosis and transformations into dream, play, and reverie? We don't have time, but it would be interesting to say if this model could be better illustrated by saying transformation in dreaming, which is only way, again, to remember, look for the unconscious, and transformation in play. Maybe transformation in play could also be better. Why? Because if we only say transformation in dreaming, we know that we can interpret dreams even like detectives. That was the classical way. Thus, it does not necessarily imply the analyst's deep participation. On the opposite, if we say transformation into play, you always have to play together. You always are engaged, deeply engaged. You always somehow contribute to develop the play, and you always are within a fictional frame if you are playing. Anyway, The difference is that with reverie, transformation into dreaming is mostly conscious and intentional. In transformation in dreaming, so to say, I decide somehow to listen in a certain way. In reverie, images cross my mind, but more or less I still know that I am awake and that they are fantasy images. Not so for the transformation into hallucinosis. So there is a difference. Until I rectify the error, no? An awakening that happens immediately with the sleep and the parapraxis, but that can take much longer in many other cases, when it has a different nature, I am absolutely convinced of it. That's the point. No? With hallucinosis, before I realized the mistake, it's really like dreaming when you are immersed in a dream. It's true, it's real. Huh? As it were, I am completely immersed in the phantasmagoria of dream images. If I did not wake up from the dream, I could not know that I had dreamt. It's only when I come to realize my hallucination that I make it a hallucinosis, no? Metaphorically, like in the psychiatric definition. The pattern somehow thus follows that of transformation into a dream or reverie, but significantly different degrees of awareness are implied. That's why I say that transformation in hallucinosis really is what is most similar to truly dreaming during the night, much more than reverie, and then listening, deciding to listen in a certain way as if it were a dream. An essential point to keep in mind is that it would be absurd to work while paying too much attention to transforming into dreams, that is to, so to say, interpreting reality. We would find ourselves leaning too much on the rational and abstract pole of thinking and overly limiting our oniric or imaginative capacity. I already mentioned this principle before. We need to remember that we should work accordingly to this principle of oscillation between negative capability, don't worry, don't want to understand, don't want to, you don't need to wanting to be cured, to empathize, no, just listen. And then, as Jim Grotstein used to say, memory, understanding, and desire will come back to you at the right moment, which is the concept of somehow selected fact. Because when we explain what transformation in dreaming is, wrongly we may give the idea that then the analyst instant by instant should pay attention to perform this kind of transformation. Not at all, not at all. Let yourself listen without worrying too much about this. But if you interiorize the model will come back to interrogate you. Huh? Rather, it is a matter, so again, it is a matter of allowing ourselves to be surprised by the resurfacing of this point of view. If we put things in these terms, the difference between transformation into hallucinosis and transformations into dreaming fades somehow, but up to a certain point. Indeed, while it is true that a projective hallucinatory activity is always present in both normal and pathological perception, it is also true that there is an enormous difference between those who hallucinate in the psychiatric sense and those who don't. As for those who truly hallucinate, transformation into hallucinosis, I repeat, is marked by its intensity. So, because, for example, we could ask ourselves, yes, but why sometimes this phenomenon comes up? And maybe we could argue, hypothetically, that there is some kind of necessity for something to pop up in the form of hallucination instead of as reverie and stuff. In my eyes, this means that when this occurs, the emotional need it reflects has become particularly urgent, as in the examples I gave before. Now, interpretation or conversation, I think that all the time in psychoanalysis we have to deal with two big issues, two splits. One is that between subject and object. I found recently a significant quote by Ludwig Binswanger, the great psychiatrist and psychotherapist, the founder of existential psychology, who writes in Ellen West case that on the split between subject and object, as we know, comes mainly from Descartes. He says that it is the cancer of psychology. And we know that all the big philosophy of the last century tried basically to overcome this split, from Husserl to Derrida, etc. The other big split is between mind and body. I don't think we'll go too far if we simply overturn this dichotomy instead of looking at it in dialectical terms. It should be obvious to us that we are immersed in the world and that we generate meaning through our body, sensations, emotions, actions. And that at the same time, as Heidegger says, incredibly, perceiving, so perceiving is always language and jointly a saying of words. That is why conceptualizing the place of the body in analysis is of the utmost importance. So then, let us deal with somatic reverie, or what, in honor, as I said, of action painting, also known as gestural abstraction, I call now action reverie. In my eyes, and consequently with what I have just stated, in general, the semiotic processes of signification cannot be separated from the semantic process of signification. By the way, even words have bodies, especially poetic words. So, if it has any specific meaning in analogy to the discourse and affectivity of the hypochondriac, that of action reverie would be of drawing attention to non-verbal communication. Here it's a bit cryptic, but I'm referring to a famous passage by Freud where he says that there is a kind of hypochondria in the dream, because in the dream we can spot somatic illnesses at their very beginning, a thing that we are not able to do at this stage consciously. So there is the idea that somehow dreaming is like a magnifying lens. So sensations, gestures, but also prolonged sequences of interaction. Think, for example, of how easily lately patients communicate with us through WhatsApp, can be interpreted as field phenomena. I've already given a couple of examples of action reverie in the vignette of the snail tiger and in the one titled Abjection. Another way of paying attention to nonverbal communication, but always again, because we are talking about dreaming, nonverbal communication, always read as a jointly dreaming phenomenon, is to try as much as possible to make the interpretation natural or embodied. I'm wondering if I have to skip some part, maybe yes. Okay, let's skip this page. I think that in psychoanalysis, to me, it's useful to think, to summarize psychoanalysis with two words, interpretation and recognition. They are the two keywords of our work, the alpha and omega of psychoanalysis. But by interpretation, I mean mainly the way we listen, the way we listen for the unconscious, in order to find, in order to use the kind of understanding we can get as a guide to, so to say, meet the patient and try to favor the process of mutual recognition, which Bion calls attunement. So to me, interpretation is not so much, I prefer to use this word, not so much to refer to what you tell the patient, but more about how you interpret, meaning how you use your psychoanalytic theories in order to understand what is going on. So, interpretation of the unconscious and recognition are the two keywords of our work, the alpha and omega of psychoanalysis. What we aim for is recognition. The issue is that mutual recognition is not just conscious recognition. Thinking of it as just conscious is a common mistake. Recognition is a designation for the process by which a mind is born and grows. Why do we interpret the unconscious? Because we try, so why do we say we have to transform into dreaming? We have to pay attention to the narratives, to the plots, to the characters, to the emotions that they represent. Because we try to get an idea of how this process is going on. And if it is going in the right direction, we may say progression, or in the wrong direction, we may say regression. The construction of linkings or the destruction of linkings. Our mind, let's remember, is made of linkings. So whatever intervention the analyst does, intervention in this case is like an interpretation that is given to the patient. It is important that it stems from interpretation as the way the analyst listens to what is unconsciously going on. People always ask me what I would say to the patient. In the end, I invented an acronym to summarize the spectrum of possible things to say, just the most easiest things we can do in this conversation, which is scream, just very briefly, give self-disclosure as, but I'd say rarely if possible and with caution. Play the Greek chorus, C, just to repeat something that was said. Pay attention to reveries, R. Map the emotion, E. Don't miss transformation in hallucinosis, so this is A, but in Italian the word starts with A, not H. Reformulate with metaphor, M, or a simile, which is always a wonderful thing to do, because it's like giving a patient a micro dream, a portable dream that can be interrogated and interrogated many times. The analyst can also offer deep interpretation, very saturated interpretation. This is a language that can be shared with the patient. But you see, the goal is attunement, is being on the same wavelength, at unison, is not the amount of knowledge you transmit. If you transmit knowledge, even sophisticated knowledge, hierarchically, before there is attunement, developing the function, and only after comes the content. If you give contents that break the functioning, the container, that is not useful at all, okay? So the place of therapy, still the place of therapy is in the quality of listening, how I listen. And this is at the service of tuning in to the same emotional wavelength. If I listen maintaining the you and I split, as we saw, then it's all about you are doing this to me, I'm doing this to you. You are unconsciously attacking me, seducing, manipulating, or in certain cases, it's me unconsciously doing the same to you. So again, we don't get out of this suspicious way of listening, which to my eyes very easily becomes ideological, moralistic, and judging, even with the best intentions in the world. Instead, if I listen from a field point of view, whatever is said is the reflection on what we are dreaming together. This, as I say, is a radical change. Whatever I say to the patient, if I listen from this perspective, it sounds different. It's also an interpretation that most of the times remains within the narrative genre proposed by the patient. In other words, the main goal is developing the tools for thinking. That's why I say that for us, it's important to rely to the model of the mother-infant relationship. Because if you focus on that, immediately you are obliged to exclude the role of knowledge as content. You are obliged to ask yourself how an infant that cannot understand the language grows his mind. And that is our challenge today, I think. Finding contents is useful, but the first thing is to respect the tolerability for the patient for what we tell him. A content that does not comply with the capacity of the container risks, as we said, being traumatic. Both content and containing are important, but hierarchically, the latter comes first. Richard, tell me if I can, as we started, I can still take 10, 15 minutes or?
Absolutely. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. So I have to say that no, I want to skip this. I just want to touch again a bit what I told you before, because it's a point of so many misunderstandings. No? Again, when we use this paradigm, this radical paradigm of dreaming, when we say that ideally, virtually, everything can be listened to as if it were a dream, and then people tell us, and then you neglect the reality, and you neglect the past, and you neglect trauma, and the session becomes a vague, unreal things. Not at all, not at all, not at all. But I have to recognize that explaining these things is not easy. In fact, I wrote, regrettably, it seems that and I also mentioned Ferro and myself and the other colleagues that are developing this kind of psychoanalysis here and around, because thanks God they are growing and everywhere, are unable to convey the idea that analysis as we mean it does not take place at all in a vague, dreamy, or unreal atmosphere. Sometimes we give this impression, maybe because we emphasize so much the idea of dreaming the session, which, by the way, is the main Freudian paradigm, unconscious and dreaming. But the dreaming of the session is just a way to remember that you need always, more or less, to be woken up, surprised by, or at least listening to what the unconscious meaning is of whatever is said, nothing more. For example, and I give another little example, always trying to convey this idea. For example, if the narrative register proposed by the patient is that of history or current reality or current trauma linked to reality, the virus, for example, there will be a paper in, I think, in American journal where I've been invited to write about the pandemic, and I propose this point of view. I give some dreams, my dreams also, a patient's dream, and I say, okay, of course, we have to participate humanly to what is happening, to the drama we are sharing and stuff. Absolutely, absolutely. But in the end, if the theater of analysis is not closed, if we are still there to do our job, meaning to give to focusing on psychic reality, we still need somehow to listen also the virus and the vaccine and whatever, in the way we do with whatever comes in our room. So if a patient says, this is a banal example, yesterday the cat ran away from the house. For example, I could simply say, why? Patient, because someone stupidly left the door open. I could say, sometimes we think we can trust someone in the family, but then we realize we would have been better not to. Very, very, very simple, banal comment, but you see that somehow I am catching what is the emotion. Well, I'm trying to catch what is the emotion that is behind what the patient is feeling, his rage, disappointment, and stuff. my way to saying this, it's very open. It's an invitation to continue, to expand the narrative. I don't want to close telling, okay, this is what it is. This is my, no. But in my mind, I'm taking responsibility for this. We left some door open and the cat between inverted commas, ran away. And the patient could say, yes, however, they are usually, however, they are careful. This could be a sign that the patient felt contained by my comment. We are on the same wavelength. I may say true, and immediately we get into a less persecutory atmosphere. What would we do? I could say, what would we do if we couldn't trust anyone in the house? But of course, in my mind, I'm thinking to our house, to our, so to say, cat, to what we leave run away, how much we are or are not careful. Huh? But I don't need to make all of this explicit to the patient, not at all. The patient at this point might say, but now I don't know where the cat is, and I'm very worried. I could reply, yes, because you would imagine that it could get into some kind of trouble. The patient, yes, but cats are said to have several lives, and so on. What I'm not going to say is kind of, you are telling me that we are having a dream in which a cat ran away from the house because someone left the door open. That dream is a kind of reverie that tells us what's happening to us when we are immersed in a climate of worry, anxiety, and mutual distrust. It is true that we seem to think we have enough resources to solve it. This is what I'm not at all going to say. We should be the equivalent of transference interpretation, so more or less in another model. I stay at the level of the patient's discourse. So, in one of the vignettes I presented in the paper on the coronavirus, it's about a patient of mine talking about his father-in-law risk dying. And I humanly participate, and I tell what I can and stuff. But of course, at a certain point, I am reminded that I should also listen to this narrative in another way. Is it out, either this on that, or are we capable of performing this kind of binocular vision? I think yes. This is what I'm not at all going to say. I stay at the level of the patient's discourse, but I listen. What is important is that if I listen in a certain way, I trust my unconscious and the patients, and I stop being suspicious or moralistic somehow. In fact, inevitably, even if I listen in this way, I arrive to know everything about the patient's life, the patient's past, the trauma he has suffered. I don't see any problem with that. I see no difficulty in maintaining this kind of binocular vision, which, like that of the eyes, gives depth and perspective to the vision. On the other hand, this kind of functional split between different planes of intentionality is the one we normally perform and use when we make an allusive speech, for example, or in everyday life we make irony or read a fairy tale. We are perfectly capable of assisting to a Sophocles tragedy at the theater and distinguishing what is on stage and what is in the audience. But again, I have to admit that through the clinical example we present, it doesn't seem that we are really able to clarify this issue effectively to people. So I hope that today it was a bit clearer. Another thing I have to add, in a recent conference with Danner Stern and Jay Greenberg, both very good friends of mine, I presented a vignette, a true vignette with a very severe patient, which is also published, so which is similar to the example of the cat. And rightly, they told me that a similar session, it could have been one of their sessions, and I was happy to hear this because it was a way to tell me, okay, we recognize that you don't do weird, don't say weird things. But I didn't have the time, so it's just something I'm adding now. I didn't have the time because the meeting was ending to tell them that what to me is important is the way you listen, even if you don't find it in the protocol of the session. So the way you listen, which in I, you split or we, with a certain idea of the unconscious or another, in my opinion, profoundly affects your attitude. And this is felt, and this is the field. So if you only consider the written text, it's not enough. Anyway, I have just one more page, and it's about trying to differentiate the concept of field and that of enactment. So let's remember what the proposal I made at the beginning, when I try to give some a concept that can help us to see all the incredible continuity that goes through the 100 years of psychoanalysis, even of course without neglecting the discontinuities and also the changes of paradigms. I said, a way I see it is that starting from the project of a scientific psychology and arriving to the post-Bionian field theory, every new concept tried to enlarge the concept of the unconscious. And in the end, this became every time trying to get a bit more of the analyst within it. So transfer, then counter-transfer, then projective identification, and then, for example, all the different kinds of third, and also enactment. I think that enactment is very useful, is a real progress, because it tells us that somehow with the patient in a very symmetrical way, even for a long period of time, you can be engaged in acting within a certain kind of script without absolutely being aware of this. And so I value this concept, but I don't use it because it's different from the field. It's very different. And so I'm trying to make it a bit clearer for our audience today, because they could be confused. So I read now the page. I should arrive in 5 minutes. I could conclude. I want to stress this point. It is more important, again, how you listen than what you say. At least if, no matter what you say, it does, because otherwise it would be some kind of wild analysis. Not at all, not at all. Sometimes, very often people tell me, yes, but this is too difficult. It's not difficult. No. But you can be more spontaneous if you have coherent principles that stay behind that spontaneity. Spontaneity does not have to become spontaneism. So it's not, I'd say I am exaggerating, but I'm saying it's not important so much what you say, but what is important is what you say does have to come from your interpretation or understanding. Receptivity to unconscious becomes the true place of care. The fact that after listening, it is a task for the analyst consciously to take on, shows that if we highlight the intersubjective plane of the field or third mind, etc., we run no danger of neglecting the dimension of subject or individuals we too are. This is another common objection. If you look at the intersubjective as common in this thing, where do subjects go? Where do individuals go? Nowhere. They stay there and they strengthen. Because what we call a subject is made, in my opinion, from a side of subjectivity and a side of intersubjectivity, language and stuff, otherwise instincts. Because otherwise we would not say that the I with Hegel is us, or that the I, the ego, is the other. So if we recognize this, and I think that we all agree on this, because the other is the unconscious, then we have to admit that we are made by this subjective polarity and intersubjective polarity. And if the one strengthens, the other somehow automatically strengthens. If the field in itself becomes more capable of give meaning to experience, even individuals, the patient and the analyst, when they go home, are more capable of give meaning to their emotional experience by themselves, each of them. Huh? So, if the group of two, of analyst and patient, is able each time to move from functioning as a basic assumption group to functioning as a working or sophisticated group, this is beyond the definition. Obviously, each of them as an individual internalizes and takes on this new capacity. This issue is easily misunderstood. You do not have to confuse the unconscious plane of the relationship that we can describe as symmetrical with the conscious one that, of course, we describe as asymmetrical. Otherwise, I don't see why we should get paid for what we do. What's more, now, if we try to distinguish the idea of field from that of enactment, a nice quote from Gerson, 2004, can help us. He writes that the enactment literature contains scant reference to a jointly created unconscious. Rather, the formulations offered typically involve how, this is very clear, very important, how two distinct unconsciouses affect each other. This is what I mean relational as opposed to field. Of course, from another point of view, the field model is very relational, but not in the same way as conceiving two separate subjects interacting. Huh? And he goes on. The unconscious is represented almost exclusively as a property of each individual in interaction with another's similarly bounded, even if responsive, unconscious. So you see, I think that he wrote the difference very, very clearly. Now, the concept of enactment, therefore, does not imply, according to Gerson, but also we know that by enactment, we nowadays can mean many different things. So, that a third is generated as an intersubjective analytic third or third mind. It seems more an obstacle or a resistance to be dissolved. This was anticipated by the Beranger conception of bastion or bulwark, which in fact is commonly mistaken with the concept of field in post-Bionian field theory. No matter if, among other important influences, it has paved the way for it. So this is another common mistake, in my opinion. People think that the Beranger is a true is a field theory, or it is the post-Bionian field. Not at all, not at all. Look, go back to read what the Beranger say. They have many merits, and they in fact introduced this idea of something that is jointly unconsciously created by the two, and they introduced this idea of field taken from Merleau-Ponty. Even if you find the pages in Bion in which he speaks of a field, and he takes the metaphor from physics. These are the pages in Transformations where he speaks about the principle of uncertainty, Heisenberg. So we find already in Bion the link with the concept of field as a metaphor for a certain way of conceptualizing the unconscious that comes from physics. And in physics, as you know, the principle of uncertainty says that you cannot distinguish what is there and stuff. So let's remember, even if the Beranger strongly contributed to post-Bionian field theory is much different than the Beranger idea of field. The Beranger idea of field, to me, looks like very much like what later was called enactment. And in fact, like enactment, they say that is something that has to be solved, recognized, and somehow destroyed. On the contrary, to me, the field is a jointly creative device that constructs and creates the meaning for reality. It can go toward regression or progression. It can be red or green traffic light, but it's not at all something circumscribed, waiting to be recognized and eliminated. Okay, I'm just going to conclude just one paragraph. In fact, okay. In fact, awareness of the analyst's inevitable and massive participation in determining the facts of the analysis leads in many cases to a paradox. Yes, this it's very important to say also. Sometimes the contemporary stress on the relational, the participation of the patient, but if it to conscious participation in the end becomes kind of not giving importance as we should to what is going on unconsciously. I think that there is a lot of rhetoric on trauma and the past. Are we going before Freud, before the discovery of psychic reality and the unconscious? Think of all the rhetoric of about witnessing. What does it mean, witnessing? Anyway, so I mean, this is contradictory because relational model, some of them, in some cases, they would take within much more of the analyst subjectivity. But if we don't continue to keep deep attention to the unconscious, this becomes kind of collapsing again on trauma, reality, and the rhetoric of witness. Okay, well, I'd only say as my last sentence, and I thank you very much for your patience, that for all these reasons, for what I tried to say with my English, by the way, I think we can say that we can agree that the paradigm of dreaming, this was the question in the title of the paper, is maybe, at least from this point of view, from this perspective, maybe even more essential to psychoanalysis than it used to be. And in this sense, it can be, I am proud to say that I think that I am really close to Freud's inspiration, to the spirit of Freud, which is working with dream and the unconscious. Thank you very much, Richard and all.
Giuseppe, grazie mille for a wonderful, wonderful presentation. It really took me off into wonderful waking dreams. I will say that I love your metaphors of the traffic light, especially those of us who live in New York City know about traffic lights. And I enjoyed your case presentation about the snail and the tiger. I think in my case, I'm working with a lot of tigers who I would prefer to become snails. So I want to thank you for your momentary demonstration of hallucinosis earlier in the session. And I think we're going to have a wonderful question and answer period later on. So at this time, this is our first break for the day. We will resume, actually, we'll take a 10-minute break so that we can keep on the schedule, and we will come back together at 11:15.